Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we're going to be doing our updated meta deck tier list for the second week of the Secluded Springs season. So already here on the screen, we have our tier list as it was constructed and built out last week, a week from today. One thing I will say is that a lot has changed so far already. Now, this is quickly becoming one of the most rapidly developing metagames that we've ever seen in Pokemon Pocket, and not in a bad way, in a really good way. I think that a lot of really strong decks are emerging. The counter meta really kind of rose and then balanced out, and then really everything's kind of come around full circle already. So a lot of changes. The tier list will probably look very different this week. And again, that's sort of just what happens, right? That's why we do these videos every week. We sort of update our opinions, we update our lists, we update our tier lists, and that's just because the viability of certain decks change when, other decks see play or, change depending on what other decks are in the format. So let's get right into it. This is following our tournament this past weekend. A lot of very interesting results have, I guess, appeared or, have been showcased. And I think that things are going to continue to develop over the next few weeks or so. I'm really excited. I believe the Secluded Spring season is going to go almost a full 4 weeks, if I am correct. So we have at least about 2.5 more weeks, at least, I believe. Probably about 3 weeks, actually, until the next season comes out. So anyway, let's dive right into it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. We're going to start from the top down. So keep in mind, we did have a bunch of decks here in the low data tier. We removed them from the tier list. Basically, if decks stop seeing any play, we can't really rank them accurately. So we're going to go ahead and just move them off of the tier list every week. But we'll start from the top down, and then we have a handful of new decks as well to talk about in today's video. First off, we have Suicune and Giratina. Okay, so yeah, we're going top down here. So what's going on with Suicune and Giratina? So the way that we actually separate these on the tier list is any Suicune Greninja deck that is playing Giratina or any Suicune Greninja deck that's not playing Giratina. Most decks at this point just sort of play 1 copy of Giratina, although there are some that still play 2 copies of Giratina. One thing I will say is that Giratina seemingly is more and more, I guess, active or is appearing more often on the board early game, which actually does really change up things for Suicune. I know a lot of people are sort of sometimes confused as to what are we really doing with Giratina? The thing with Giratina is that it opens up a completely new line, right? There are a lot of times that Broken Space Bellowing going first with Giratina actually opens up a win condition, whereas if you don't have Giratina on that first turn, you're not going to be able to have that win condition. Now, the counter meta has developed around Suicune, right? This was by far the most played deck of the format this past week. Currently, right now, it's sitting at a total of 17.5% meta share, which is quite high. It's not nearly close to the highest we've ever seen in particular seasons and for particular decks, but it's certainly up there. Definitely one of the best decks that we've ever seen in Pokemon Pocket. Suicune is an incredible card, and even though the meta has really developed around countering Suicune, it is still the major player. It is still sort of the top player here. It did get second place at our tournament and various other top 8 and top 16 finishes. It had a tremendously high win rate for being such a countered deck, and a deck that, of course, saw so much play. In my mind, it's really no question. I believe that Suicune Giratina is still an S-tier deck without really any question about that. That's sort of how I feel. Now, Giratina Darkrai is sort of a different question. It's a different thing here. Giratina Darkrai, to me, definitely doesn't feel as dominant as it has in previous seasons. It is still the second most played deck, floating at around 11% meta share, and it still has a very quality win rate. In my estimation, Giratina Darkrai will probably stay around a 51 to 52% win rate, just because of how consistent the deck is and how many decks in general really aren't countering Giratina Darkrai. But one thing I will say is that there is some counterbalancing between the counterplay to Suicune and Giratina Darkrai. I was actually not very high on Oricorio for a long time. Early in the season, I just felt like Greninja was everywhere, and Oricorio just didn't really feel like a super safe bet. However, people have changed their Oricorio decks and the way that they're playing Oricorio in a way that I think is also valuable in the Suicune matchup. You got to keep in mind, Oricorio is good against Giratina and against Suicune. It's just the Greninja part that is a little bit of a downturn, but you can build Oricorio in some aggro-type deck lists like Tapu Koko and Oricorio that we have down here. Definitely entered in as a significant counter meta player here. You have to keep in mind that I think that any deck list that is looking to counterplay Suicune and Giratina and be relevant in the metagame also has to at least have a decent to strong matchup into Giratina and Darkrai. So for that sense, I feel like Giratina Darkrai as the second most played deck probably still has to stay S tier just because of its influence in its, I guess, its ability to determine the viability of other decks in the format, right? It's not something you can discredit. Oricorio is still going to be valuable because, again, 11%, 10% of the meta share is going to be Giratina and Darkrai. So we have to keep that in mind. I still believe Giratina Darkrai is probably an S tier deck list, and I don't know if we're going to have any new S tier contenders. It's an interesting thing to I guess, talk about, but we'll get there when we get there, right? Next up is going to be Suicune and Greninja without Giratina. So, quite frankly, I feel like at this point, everybody is playing Suicune and Greninja with Giratina. I feel like there's very few lists at this point that are playing this archetype, but not playing at least one Giratina in it. There was people playing Palkia or Mantike, or some people are playing Oricorio, but typically, even if you're playing those cards in Suicune, you're oftentimes still playing Giratina, which to me means like this deck list honestly probably doesn't really exist anymore, and we don't really have a real reason to split them up on the tier list. It's probably going to be more confusing if we do that, so we're going to move Suicune and Greninja without Giratina just to the low data tier. I just don't really feel like it's worth mentioning at this point. Everybody playing Suicune, at least at the moment, is playing Giratina, so we're going to go ahead, move it down to the low data tier. Next week, it'll be off the tier list. Next up is Turbo Dark Arceus, which is a very interesting deck to me because not only was this the #1 most performing deck here in day one, or I should say of our tournament, in the first phase of our tournament, the #1 ranked player was playing Turbo Dark Arceus. However, the average win rate for this deck was actually quite low, and I think a big reason for that was a lot of people playing Oricorio, quite frankly. There was a lot of different lightning type decks, aggro decks, Oricorio decks, Repel was very common as well. I just don't really feel like this deck list has as much weight as it maybe did early on. Certainly a really strong turbo deck list, but in my mind, I just don't feel like it has what it really needs to. It does play Kamala, but in general, I just don't feel as strongly about this deck. It is effectively a high roll deck. If you go second every game and in a best of one tournament, like we had, it's very likely, or at least somewhat likely, that at least one player playing one of these turbo decks ends up going second turn after turn, right? Very unbeatable in certain scenarios, but overall a bit inconsistent. Repel is very common. You can, have that go turn one. You can even just go first. You can even just not really draw into the Pokemon you need to. So for that reason, I don't feel as strongly about this deck currently right now. Is it still an A tier contender? I don't know. Like, that's what I'm really kind of on the fence about. I think for right now, I'm going to put it like high B tier. We're going to be a little bit more selective with our A tier spots, but I think a lot of other decks have moved up to the A tier. So for now, I'm going to keep this here at the B tier. I am a little bit biased because of its overall performance at our tournament this weekend, but because our tournament this weekend had so many strong players and a lot of really competitive, I guess, it was a heavily competitive tournament. So I think that it really did showcase maybe the gaps in some decks matchups, at least going into this sort of second to third week period in this metagame. We're going to move it down to the B tier for now. I don't think it's a bad deck. High B tier is probably a spot where really strong decks are going to reside. So it's going to go right there. Now, next up, though, is Guzzlord. Okay, so let's talk about Guzzlord. The third most played deck so far this season. We have to be a little bit weary because any deck that's not Suicune or Giratina Darkrai isn't seeing nearly as much play. However, if we take a look at the meta share from our tournament this past weekend, Guzzlord was actually exactly tied with Giratina Darkrai as the second most played deck. I believe it also had about a 50% win rate, but we also have to keep in mind that it did win the tournament, and to me that does mean something. So I think that Guzzlord, quite honestly, is actually the #1 counter meta deck that is actually the most strong or the most viable against the other counter meta deck options, right? Does that make sense? So out of all of the decks that is specifically strong into Suicune and Giratina, it's good against the rest of the decks better than the other decks, right? So that in general just means that it's a very, very strong deck. It did get first place. Various people placed well with it, and it's kind of rising up to potentially be the second most played deck by the time the season is over. I actually do feel quite strongly about moving Guzzlord up into the S tier. I think that it is sort of the other meta driver. I think that at this point, people really have to contend with Guzzlord. Now, on the ranked ladder, I don't know if Guzzlord's going to see nearly as much play as Giratina Darkrai and Suicune, but from a competitive tournament perspective, Guzzlord right now is as well positioned as anything. It is also a bit of an RNG deck with the coin flips, but the overall strategy is really, really good, and it has good to decent matchups, of course, into really all of the most played decks, which I think is a really big deal. Guzzlord here going into the S tier, and it's going to be definitely at the bottom of S tier. I don't think it's nearly as influential as Suicune and Giratina Darkrai, but I do think it deserves to just be right there, and I think that it has sort of surpassed its sort of A tier placement that we put it last week. It's interesting that we actually had it high A tier last week. I think we were kind of on the nose there, and I think Guzzlord has actually just become a better option, if I'm being entirely honest with you. Now, if Oricorio rises up, maybe that addresses some issues. But in general, this is a deck list that, of course, is also very consistent, and if you flip a bunch of coins, you're just going to win. You know what I mean? If you flip heads, That's how Giratina Darkrai goes, or not, sorry, that's how Guzzlord goes. So we're going to put it in the S tier. That's actually how I feel. It's definitely kind of borderline, but I'm feeling better about S tier than I would be about A tier for Guzzlord, at least right now. Next up is Turbo Flareon. So Turbo Flareon is actually the 5th most played deck overall this season, but was by far, I would say, one of the most overall well-performing archetypes at this past weekend's tournament. I really like Turbo Flareon. I think if you're playing these sort of baby Pokemon high-roll turbo deck lists, I think that Flareon is the most balanced of any of them. You can play Genetic Apex Flareon. Flareon itself has a lot of HP, but also can just be effective in the late game as well. It's not really conditional like Arceus is. And in the same vein, you can attack turn after turn with it pretty easily. Again, you got a lot of HP, and we can actually extend to deal damage to KO things like Guzzlord, which I think is a massive deal for Flareon. Being able to hit for that 170 is not something that many decks can do. Actually, really, there's only 2 decks that are commonly played in the format right now, which I find to be very interesting. And I think Guzzlord's going to see a lot more play, and Flareon likes that matchup. It likes the Giratina Darkrai matchup, and coincidentally has a winning matchup into Arceus, or not Arceus, but into Suicune as well, which is just interesting, right? So I'm actually going to keep Flareon into the A tier, but people are going to get confused probably a bit because Flareon actually has winning matchups into every deck into the S tier. But, you know, we have to look at results, and we have to look at its matchups into the overall field, which I do think it can struggle against some of the other decks that aren't up here into the S tier. So this is also one of the top decks right now. I would put it maybe 4th or 5th. Which is why high A tier seems like definitely a good placement right now for Turbo Flareon. And it's going to go right there into the high A tier. Next up is Espeon. So what's going on with Espeon? It is the 4th most played deck so far throughout the season, but it is on the heavy decline. Over the last week or so, Espeon really has found, it's just become something that I don't think many people are doing quite well with. Some people might say they're doing well on the ladder, but I think if you get into a really competitive environment, and if you're in like high Master Ball tier, I don't think the metagame is very friendly to Espeon Sylveon. I think Guzzlord is a very scary matchup. Giratina Darkrai is a scary matchup. Turbo Flareon also a scary matchup. And then of course Suicune you have to contend with, which, you know, with the Greninjas and stuff, Suicune also sort of counterplays Espeon a little bit. It requires benching a lot of Pokemon. I have seen a variant of Espeon that someone was playing where they weren't actually playing Sylveon. They were just playing 2 Espeons. Definitely doesn't feel like a bad way to play it right now, but overall, I just feel like this Psychic-based deck is probably struggling more than it did has ever has, honestly, since it entered into the format. This was, in my mind, the best deck of last season, but I think that Suicune coming into the format, Turbo Flareon really taking over for Leafeon Flareon, and then Guzzlord, this new version of Guzzlord becoming very popular. You got to keep in mind, Guzzlord was the #1 meta counter to Espeon last season. And at this point, it's actually overtaken it in play rate, which is it's a pretty dramatic change there. So for that reason, I actually feel like Espeon is dropping down. Now, I don't know where I want to drop it down to, whether I want to drop it down to B tier or C tier right now. I'll put it B tier for now, but I think it's going to end up probably being a low B tier choice. The deck is consistent, and yes, it's strong. I just think from a viability perspective, in terms of its matchup spreads into the most played decks right now, I don't feel very comfortable playing Espeon. So we're going to put it down here into the B tier. It's definitely better than C tier decks, but I think B tier is probably an accurate place for it to go. Now, Buzzwole is an interesting one. Probably one of the more confusing things for me to talk about right now, because Buzzwole has struggled a lot over the last, really over the first week. Again, I think that Suicune and Giratina does quite fine into Buzzwole. I think that, and I also think Turbo Flareon does really good into Buzzwole. And of course, Buzzwole struggled with Espeon, right? So we got to think, like, early on in the season, Buzzwole was not a significant choice. It is the 9th most played deck so far this season, and it has a 50.5% win rate. So it's not doing horribly. But the thing with Buzzwole is that at this point, I actually feel like it's more well positioned than it ever has been. Giratina Darkrai still seeing a lot of play, but Guzzlord now is really rising in play pretty dramatically, as well as some Oricorio decks, which are definitely going to be rising in play. So Buzzwole, to me, actually feels like it's becoming more and more well positioned as time goes on, and I find that to be very interesting. I don't really know what to think about it. It's hard. We have to do sort of a predictive analysis of Buzzwole, and I actually feel like Buzzwole is going to stay in the A tier, but I'm going to put it low A tier for now. Even though at the time when I was ranking Buzzwole, it underperformed pretty dramatically, but now as we're ranking it again, I expect it to start overperforming a little bit more than it has over the last week. So it's in a weird spot, you know what I mean? Like before we ranked it last season, it was probably A tier and then it fell off, but then now that we're ranking it in this sort of second tier list, I think that it's kind of gone back to like a low A tier spot. I still think Buzzwole's really strong. Again, you're good into Giratina Darkrai, you're good into Guzzlord, and I think that's definitely pretty valuable. In general, I actually really like Buzzwole and how well it's positioned right now. You also also have to talk about Silvally Rampardos, which we'll get to in a little bit. Definitely a deck that's becoming more and more common. And of course, Buzzwole has a good matchup in a Silvally Rampardos. So that's another factor as well. I actually like Buzzwole right now more than I ever have this season. So I have to keep it into the A tier. It's going to go like a mid to low A tier. Next up is going to be Greninja Oricorio. Now, Greninja Oricorio was something that really popped up early on this season as like a significant counterplay to Giratina Darkrai, but also was hoping to counterplay Suicune, but Suicune played Greninja, and because it's drawing through so many cards, the matchup into Suicune is actually quite low. Now, Greninja Oricorio has continued to have a high win rate. In fact, it actually has a 51, almost a 52% win rate into the field. I actually feel like if we're playing Oricorio, it has just sort of emerged as one of the better options in the better decks that you can play. So what we're going to do is actually put Greninja and Oricorio up here into the, again, the low A tier. It's a weird deck list. I feel like there's a lot of decks that are going to float into this like A tier, high B tier range. And it's a little bit hard to make that determination. But again, Oricorio is going to be quite good into Guzzlord. And again, it's always a good deck into Giratina Darkrai. And for that, I actually feel like there's a lot of merit for Greninja Oricorio. It's going to continue to see a little bit of play. It's nothing that's going to take over the metagame, but it is going to be a significant player. So we're going to go ahead and put it low A tier as well. Next up is Arceus and Tapu Koko. What's interesting is that, Arceus really stopped seeing a lot of play in lightning type decks. Turbo Arceus is still a thing, but it has been underperforming. And to be fair, if we try to find Arceus and Oricorio, or Arceus and Tapu Koko here on the data, I don't really think it's seeing that much play. Yeah, so it saw a little bit of play early in the season, but it really kind of fell off in favor of some other lightning type archetypes. So do we even talk about Turbo Arceus? I think we skipped over it. We'll get to it next. But anyway, Arceus and Tapu Koko is going to go down here into the low data tier. It's just a lightning type Arceus deck that isn't seeing play. If you're playing Arceus, you're playing Turbo Dark Arceus, and if you're playing Lightning Arceus, you're just playing Turbo Arceus with Zero Aura and Oricorio and Pichu. And if we are playing Tapu Koko, it's likely seeing play in some other decks as well. So this archetype here just doesn't really exist. People are playing these cards in different deck lists, so it's going to go down into the low data tier. But let's talk about Turbo Arceus, because we did put it into the A tier, but I don't think it's nearly as well performed as we kind of thought it might. Again, it just sort of saw more play in Turbo Dark Arceus, but we also put that into the B tier. This deck has been underperforming a bit. It is the 6th most played deck, but it has a 49% win rate. It did not do very well over the last few big tournaments, so we're going to move it down to the B tier. Again, it's definitely better than a C tier deck, but right now we're going to put it down into the B tier. We'll reorder this later on. But I think that, yeah, Turbo Lightning Arceus is going to go down into the B tier. I'll just put it right here for now, I guess. Okay, next up is Raikou and Arceus. So this was sort of the Raikou deck that I was building to counterplay Suicune early last week when I made the last tier list. But then we kind of swapped to, instead of Arceus, we were playing Pikachu EX and Tapu Koko in the list that I made a video on and then played in the tournament. I will talk about that deck list. Actually, I guess we don't actually even have it on the tier list because it didn't exist and I forgot to add it. Okay. All right. So anyway, let's talk about Raikou Arceus, because this isn't really a deck list anymore. I think it kind of got swapped out for Raikou and Tapu Koko, which in my mind is actually probably a better deck list overall, but also a deck that quickly came and went and quickly became a not very well positioned deck right now. So we'll talk about these sort of Raikou decks with Zero Aura, with Energy Switch, with Repel. I think that Raikou, and really whether you're playing with Arceus or Pikachu or Tapu Koko, that whole strategy there where you're playing Repel and Zero Aura and stuff, I don't think it's a bad deck list. It was significantly strong into Suicune. Suicune has started to play things like Guzma. They've started to play Leaf and some Retreat to get around Repel, and they play Irida as well, which can, of course, knock you off your, your ability to 2-hit KO them. But I think in general, a lot of the other decks that have Rose in play are also just strong into this sort of turbo, like aggressive Raikou deck, this sort of Raikou Toolbox deck. And in general, I feel like it kind of was extremely good into the metagame, but then things like Guzzlord really started to take over. Things like Tapu Koko and Arceus have really kind of taken that spot, I think, more recently. Umbreon seeing a little bit of play as well. Dragonite is another thing that can be a little bit difficult to deal with. But yeah, Guzzlord definitely is a matchup that we don't love running into. So when we take a look at the overall metagame, I actually don't feel that strongly about these Raikou decks currently right now. I think that there's just better options if we're trying to play a counter Suicune deck while also covering some of the other matchups into Giratina, Darkrai, and Guzzlord, which again is kind of why I think Oricorio has actually risen back up to be a little bit bit better just because of the other decks that started to see more play. So we're going to move this Raikou deck down into the C tier, but this also, we don't have Raikou Pikachu, so keep that in mind. This is like kind of also taking the spot of like the Raikou Tapu Koko Pikachu deck that we've been playing recently. It's not something I would really recommend right now. The meta has just adjusted, quite frankly, and it's developed so quickly that playing such a specific counter meta deck list just doesn't really fly. There's a lot of other decks seeing a lot of play that are strong into this archetype. So it's not something I would necessarily recommend too highly right now. We're going to move it down into the C tier. Next up, we've gotten, what is this, Turbo Silvally, another deck list that I actually don't really feel that strongly about. I think that there's other ways to play Lightning, and I think there's other ways to play Oricorio right now. In general, these deck lists just kind of don't do enough, and Pichu and the baby Pokemon are a bit of a liability, especially when you're playing against so many Greninjas in the format. Oricorio is definitely becoming a bit better. I like Silvally, but at the end of the day, if we're playing a Turbo, baby Pokemon deck, you probably want to play Flareon or something that can at least win a KO Pokemon more consistently than Silvally. So for that reason, I'm actually going to move Silvally and Pichu down also into the C tier. We're probably going to move some C tier decks up or down, but for right now, we're definitely kind of thinning out the higher ranks just because that's kind of the way that it'll go as time goes on, right? Less and less decks, I guess, become, focused around the top right of the metagame. So that's kind of how I feel there about Turbo Silvally. Next up, though, is Silvally Rampardos. So the other Silvally deck list has been doing very, very well. At this point, Silvally Rampardos is actually only the 14th most played deck this season, but it has almost a 55% win rate. In fact, I think right now is as good of a time to play Silvally Rampardos as there ever has been. Quite frankly, it's one of the decks that I would actually highly recommend right now. I'm going to be moving Silvally Rampardos way up here into the high to mid A tier. I think it's a really, really strong choice. There's a lot of counter Oricorio decks running around, but there's also, of course, Giratina, Darkrai, Guzzlord, and Suicune, and Rampardos doing that 130 is actually pretty significant. Purely single prize archetype, not a lot of the format is like super fast paced, and actually, I don't even know what else to say. I just feel like Silvally Rampardos has ended up being a really well-positioned deck for sure. So again, the counter meta to the counter meta is a bit more prevalent right now, and that's kind of the pocket that we're in this season. So Silvally Rampardos really fits that bill quite well, in fact. Okay, so next up we've gotten Aggro Guzzlord, so Poison Guzzlord with Naganadel. The 18th most played deck this season. I don't really feel too strongly about it. Basically, everybody is playing the other version of Guzzlord, the more control version of Guzzlord, which to me kind of is hard to rank a deck highly when there's another very similar deck that's kind of just better and more well-positioned, also seeing play in the format. I'm going to keep Guzzlord and Naganadel into the B tier. Again, I think it's a fine deck. Guzzlord in general can just play without Naganadel. It's just a little bit less consistent, right? But that aggro is still going to be decent into other deck lists that are a bit slow. I like it. It's not as good of a deck, I don't think, than the other Guzzlord deck, but it's certainly still a totally fine deck. Guzzlord is just a really strong Pokemon. We're going to keep this into the B tier, and I feel pretty good that just keeping the aggro Poison Guzzlord into the B tier, but I would recommend you just play Guzzlord without it, just because it's typically just a more consistent. And the aggro stuff isn't as valuable because Espeon isn't really seeing as much play. Okay, so next up is going to be Raikou and Magnezone. So Raikou Magnezone was actually the highest placing Raikou deck of our tournament, but hasn't really been that well performing of a deck throughout this entire season. It is the 10th most played deck overall, and it has a 48% win rate, which again is quite low. It's a little bit low for me to even want to consider this a B tier deck, which is kind of interesting if we think about it. And overall right now, I feel like the B tier is going to be a little bit slim. So we have to kind of, we have to pay a little bit closer attention right now to where we're ranking some of these deck lists. If Raikou Magnezone is still a B tier deck, and again, it did place fairly well, then maybe it does deserve the B tier. But you got to keep in mind as well, that one tournament result doesn't really justify the rank of a deck, you know what I mean? So we have to look at it objectively against the entire format right now. I think that Raikou can be a strong option going second, and Magnezone with Magneton and Elemental Switch does allow you to attack on turn, on your second turn going first, and that can be valuable, but Magnezone itself isn't a Pokemon that's necessarily going to carry you much into the late game. I like this deck list, but I don't know exactly how I feel about it. I'm probably going to keep this like a low B tier right now. In fact, I'm actually going to move it to the C tier. I am. We're going to be a little bit more picky with our B tier decks, and a lot of these decks down here are probably going to find a B tier spot. So anyway, there we go. We'll move Raikou Magnezone down also into the C tier. Now, speaking of other C tier decks, we also have to talk about some stuff that, we ranked last week, but in general just really isn't seeing that much play. Pikachu Toolbox, Genetic Apex Pikachu Toolbox, is a really fun deck list. It's definitely a deck that makes a little bit of sense, but again, there's just too much stuff in the format right now that can kind of deal with it pretty easily. And it's not something that's really seeing much play. Again, when we talk about lightning decks, the lightning decks have really shifted and changed around a lot just because the meta has been changing around a lot. So this Pikachu deck isn't really seeing any play. Genetic Apex Pikachu, which again, kind of makes a little bit of sense, right? It has a lot of, support and a lot of Pokemon you can pair with it. It just doesn't really make sense to play that many Pokemon in a deck when most of the time you would really only need a couple of those Pokemon for a particular matchup. So even though this deck is pretty decent, it's really not seeing any play. We have to move it down to the low data tier. Next up, though, we have Flareon and Leafeon, another deck list which just inherently, nobody really plays. It's the 33rd most played deck this season, and so far, I guess it has a 48% win rate. So, what can we really do with Flareon, Leafeon? Again, it's not a horrible deck list. I just don't really think it's nearly as good as Turbo Flareon. I think keeping it in the C tier is probably fine. I don't really have any super strong opinions about it, so we're just going to keep it right there into the C tier, and we're going to feel pretty fine about that. I think we're just gonna be okay with where that is right now, and I don't think we're gonna really jump the gun on moving that off of the tier. Next up, though, we have Dragonite. So we actually have two different versions of Dragonite because the Dragonite list that did very well at our tournament this past weekend was actually playing Sylveon. And I do think that that's the better way to play Dragonite. So I think that this version of Dragonite, when you're playing maybe double baby Pokemon and we're not playing Sylveon, or maybe you're just playing one Sylveon, I don't think it's as good. I think that the Dragonite stuff has been kind of figured out. And the Dragonite Sylveon decks that saw play at our tournament this weekend that actually did quite well are probably your best options if you're going to be playing a true high roll deck like Dragonite. We're going to keep this version of Dragonite probably here into the C tier. It does have a, It has a 47% win rate, and it is actually the 12th most played deck right now. So people are playing Dragonite, but hopefully they swap to the more successful version of Dragonite, and I think that's totally fine. We're going to keep it right here into the C tier. Nothing else to say really about it. We'll talk more about Dragonite when we get to the other version. Next up is Meowscarada. So Meowscarada, again, was a deck that popped up on the first few days of the format and did fairly well, but it really has fallen off since then. It's the 20th most played deck. It has a 44% win rate. This, I guess, if we're not going to completely move it off of the tier list, we have to move it out of the C tier. I'm going to drop Meowscarada down into the D tier. I just don't really feel like Meowscarada has enough support around it. The grass type right now in general is kind of lacking, and I just don't feel like a lot of the cards are that strong. Meowscarada itself is fairly well positioned in the format right now, but Silvally is kind of on the rise, and I don't feel that confidently about Meowscarada to see play right now, and it's probably going to end up off the tier list in subsequent weeks. So we'll put it down here into the D tier for now. Solgaleo and Sylveon, which coincidentally is actually the way that people aren't playing Solgaleo right now. In fact, has anybody played Solgaleo this way? I don't even know. I'm trying to look at the the metadata right now for the season. Solgaleo has popped up recently, but this is not the way to play it. We're going to move this actually down into the low data tier just because nobody's really playing this right now, and there's a more, I guess, commonly played way to play Solgaleo. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's going to go down into the low data tier, moving off of the tier list. Next up is Altaria. So if you guys remember, this Altaria Silvally deck actually did fairly well in previous tournaments or early in the season, but again, also really fell off. Not something that I would really recommend right now. It was sort of a one and done type archetype, and I don't really think it's that well positioned. I just feel like Silvally right now needs to be paired with a really heavy hitter. There's a reason why Turbo Silvally is also in the C tier. Altaria Silvally, not a terrible deck list right now, but a lot of decks are playing high sustain, high HP, high damage, and I just don't really feel like this deck can hang that well, even though it is a bit consistent and it has some decent pace to it. I'm going to move it down to the D tier. That's what we're going to do for Altaria and Silvally. Next up is the Rampardos decks. Now, are people really playing Rampardos is what I'm curious about. Probably not. But what I'm going to do here, just off of pure bias, is I'm going to move Donphan and Lucario down to the low data tier. This is not a deck that I would really consider anybody play this season. Donphan Rampardos is the 29th most played deck this season, and it does have a 49.5% win rate. So theoretically speaking, this isn't a deck that's really taking over the metagame. It hasn't really inserted itself as a real meta contender, but I really don't think it's a bad deck whatsoever. So I think C tier is probably a fine placement here for Donphan, and we're going to keep it there. We're going to keep it there into the C tier. The D tier filled out a little bit. We've kind of really thinned the deck, the tier list out, which again just happens, right? Over time, people just stop playing like sort of the mid tier decks and they play the high tier decks, and that's how it goes, quite frankly. Okay, let's talk about the D tier decks and what might be moving. So Darkrai Miltank, this is not a real deck. It saw a little bit of play early on in the season, but it was D tier last week. Now it just isn't seeing play. We're going to move it off the tier list here into the low data tier. Again, people just aren't really playing it. Next up is going to be Poliwrath. Now, are people actually playing Poliwrath? I know it was something that was a little bit spicy. People played it a little bit early in the season. It is actually still seeing a little bit of play, but it has like a 40% win rate, so I think we have to keep Poliwrath here also into the D tier. It's not going to move off the tier list yet, but this is, in my mind, a D tier deck currently right now. So I don't have anything else to say about Poliwrath. I think it's just a little bit more awkward, and I think Dragonite does the same thing, but it's just kind of better in basically every way. Poliwrath going down here into the D tier, and I think it's going to stay there for sure. Charizard. So let's talk about Charizard, because I've actually felt pretty strongly about Charizard in this upcoming week. I think that Charizard has a lot of potential. The interesting thing about Charizard, though, is that Dragonite is seeing a lot of play, and Guzzlord EX is seeing a lot of play. And those are two Pokemon that, quite frankly, Charizard just can't really KO, right? Most Charizard decks are playing Guzma, and they're not playing Red, which means you can't KO Guzzlord. Guzzlord is also a card that traditionally does counter Charizard because it can discard energies, live attacks, and then 2 or 3 hit KO you. That's definitely a little bit interesting, but also Dragonite seeing a lot of play. Also, to me, feels like Charizard probably isn't as well positioned as we want. Not only to mention that the most played decks in the format right now are water-type decks. So there's been a little bit of propaganda around Charizard, and I know some people have really talked about how Charizard probably has a little bit more potential right now, but I don't really feel that strongly about it. It's the 16th most played deck so far this season, but it has a 38% win rate. So literally amongst the lowest win rate decks so far. Now, that might change, but again, given all of the information we have, the results recently, Charizard hasn't done anything in a competitive setting. Somebody might tell me that, you know, a top-ranked player is playing Charizard, but again, the metagame in the top 100 of Master Ball is completely different, and it's not really something that we can kind of account for when we're building the tier list, right? 99.999% of people are not going to be in the top 100 of ranked battles. It's a completely different metagame, and honestly, I don't even know if Charizard is good in that particular rank, so I don't know, I'm just saying. For 99% of people, I would not really recommend playing Charizard. Maybe you could play it in like Great Ball or Ultra Ball and maybe not hit a bunch of decks that, you know, are at the top of the meta that are probably strong against you. But I feel like Turbo Flareon really has kind of taken the spot of Charizard. So it's going to stay there into the D tier. And now we're going to move on to some of the new inclusions here. So these are deck lists that have popped up over the last week that have either done well, consistently entered the metagame, or they're just deck lists that I guess at this point, you know, had maybe one really good performance recently that we kind of wanted to talk about them. So let's talk about Solgaleo and Entei. This is really just going to be Solgaleo, but instead of Sylveon, you're playing the legendary beasts. We're not playing any energies other than metal energy. We literally just play metal. We just use the legendary beasts to draw cards and kind of soak up damage in the active spot, and that allows us to move through our deck list, and then we don't even have to worry about retreating because Solgaleo can kind of do that on its own. It is a deck list that makes sense. I'm not gonna lie. I think that this is actually probably a better way to play Solgaleo right now than to play Sylveon and a bunch more Pokemon. Now, I still don't feel like this is a deck that probably, you know, warrants like a ton of consideration into the metagame. I don't think it did very well this past weekend. It has become the 28th most played deck, and it has a 48% win rate. So without the ties, it's about a 49% win rate. Again, it's a totally average deck list, and I don't feel like it's really taking over anything significant, but it did have one good placement recently, but I don't think it'll really end up being anything that significant. We're going to put it down here into the C tier. I'll put it like middle C tier. We're not really, the placements of the decks and the tiers don't really matter that much, quite frankly. Let's talk about Giratina and Latios. So, you know, Frog EX and Numentali did play this deck this past weekend and actually did quite well with it. Now, I don't really, again, think this is a deck that's really going to take over the metagame. It's hard to really rank it because it was only played by a couple of people. One player did do fairly well with it. It's a Psychic-type Giratina deck, which does give it some merit, and of course, Latios can, of course, also do 130 damage. So, to me, this is kind of like the way that people have kind of adjusted from playing Mewtwo and Giratina, so they're just sort of playing Latios and Latios Giratina. You can play Latios and deal some chip damage as well, which is pretty cool in the early game, but overall, I don't feel that strongly about this deck list. I mean, I think that it's definitely not horrible, right? It's a real deck list. You can win games with it. You know, a strong player making all of the right decisions might have a good run, which of course is probably what we saw this past weekend, but is it really a meta contender? It's hard to say just because not many people have played it, quite frankly. It's not really something that, you know, we have seen a bunch, right? It's got a 48% win rate so far, a very low sample size, but you know, because it did well in the tournament and it was pretty cool, I wanted to put it on the tier list, so I'm just going to put it down here into the C tier, right next to Solgaleo and Entei. Next up, though, is Tapu Koko and Oricorio. So this is a really interesting one. So I think that this is really the deck list that I think is kind of taking over for a lot of these more aggro, flex, lightning type decks that are here to kind of counter Suicune, but at the same time not auto-lose to some of the more significant decks that aren't Suicune in the metagame, like Turbo Flareon, like Guzzlord. And I think that Tapu Koko Oricorio actually does that pretty well. It's a very simple deck list, which means that there's not a lot of pieces going around. You have a lot of room to add other cards that can be pretty relevant. I actually feel really strongly right now that this is probably one of the more well-positioned decks in the format, probably the best lightning type deck right now. I love Raikou, I really do, but Raikou's not very good into Guzzlord or into Giratina Darkrai, and those are decks that are seeing a lot of play. So Oricorio to me has actually gone from being a deck that wasn't very significant to being a card that is actually quite significant in the metagame. You're going to be seeing a lot of Giratina Darkrai, you're going to be seeing a lot of Guzzlord, and Oricorio does have its value into Suicune until, of course, they get those Greninjas up and running, but it can protect you in those first few turns of the game. Tapu Koko is actually a card that is extremely good into Suicune. Going first or second, you can attack really, really early and get that damage ramped up on Tapu Koko quite early. I really like it. I like Tapu Koko this season as much as really any lightning type card. The bench damage and the draw power from Raikou is quite good, but the issue with Raikou is that we can't deal that much damage with it, right? So it caps at 60 damage, and to be fair, there's a lot of healing in the format. There's a lot of high HP Pokemon. If we're not 2-hit KOing, it's just not that consistent. So unless we're hitting for weakness onto things like Suicune, Raikou really isn't that good into a lot of other decks in the format. Tapu Koko, though, is actually quite good. It is. It's got good pace and it deals better damage. It also has a retreat cost of 1, which is pretty relevant. I like it. It pairs well with Oricorio. This is a really smart deck. Again, it's a deck that makes sense not only into the Suicune matchups, but into all of the other top most played decks as well, which is, I think, a reason why this is a really, really strong deck. I'm going to put it right here, high A tier. We might just actually put it right here at the top of A tier. I don't know who created this deck or where it came from. I don't know off the top of my head, but whoever did, I give them a ton of credit because I think at this point in the metagame, this is kind of the best way to play these sort of counter meta lightning decks. I really feel quite strongly about this deck list. It's, let's see, it's the 17th most played deck so far, and it has a 55% win rate. So very, very strong counter meta presence here for Tapu Koko and Oricorio. Again, the Raikou stuff, we're moving it down to C tier. It's not something I would heavily recommend at this point. The counter meta has developed. It's gone and passed. We need to be playing a deck that is not only just good against one deck, but against several decks, which I think Tapu Koko Oricorio does better than a lot of other things for sure. So the Umbreon deck is really interesting. I like Umbreon. It's another deck list that theoretically is really, really strong into the top decks of the format, right? Suicune's a basic Pokemon. Giratina's a basic Pokemon. Guzzlord's a basic Pokemon. Darkrai's a basic Pokemon. Umbreon, the non-EX Umbreon, actually puts in a ton of work. If you can get it out early and you can start dealing a bunch of damage, your opponent literally can't attack you. And then by the time that they can kind of get around that Umbreon, we can go into Umbreon EX and then just sort of clear out our opponent by, of course, bringing up whatever we want into the active spot. It's a strategy that actually makes a lot of sense. And for whatever the reason, you know, it's just the way the Pokemon Pocket goes. Espeon was the best deck, and now it's really not well positioned. Umbreon was a horrible deck list, but now I actually feel like it's fairly well positioned just based around the metagame, right? The legendary beasts have changed things around pretty dramatically. How do I feel about Umbreon? It hasn't seen that much play yet. It has a decent win rate. I think it has potential. I'm going to go ahead and put it right here into the B tier. I'm going to put it right next to... I'll put it right in the middle. I'll put it right here. I think it's definitely a fine deck list. Not a crazy deck, but not a bad deck whatsoever. We're going to put it right there into the B tier. I think it's a solid inclusion into the metagame and kind of appropriate that it fits right next to Espeon as well. I think these are really fun decks, but Umbreon is actually, it puts in a lot of work, and the one player that did have a good run with it did showcase what it could do against some of the top meta counters, or top meta players, which I think is really cool. It's a really, really, really cool deck. Next up is going to be Dragonite and Sylveon. So this is the other Dragonite deck. This is the Dragonite deck that I think you probably should be playing. And again, I think that Dragonite actually has a fairly decent position in the metagame. It is a true high roll deck list. This is not a deck that's going to be that consistent, but if it does get up and running, if it does get to where it wants to go, it's going to be very difficult to beat Dragonite. And again, I do think that Guzzlord in the format right now actually has created a pretty significant spot for Dragonite as one of the few Pokemon that can set up and then sweep through. Guzzlord, it can 1-hit KO, caped Giratina, caped Suicune. It's actually a fairly big deal. Like, there's a lot of Pokemon that love to kind of, use sustain, right? Like, Suicune is playing Giant Capes and Irida. Guzzlord plays a bunch of healing. Giratina Darkrai plays Giant Cape and healing. Like, being able to 1-hit KO this Pokemon is actually a pretty significant deal. And the meta right now is a little bit mixed, so it's not fully aggro and it's not fully sort of mid-range. It is sort of kind of a mix, right? It's a format where a lot of the decks are kind of fully ramped up on turn 3 or turn 4. And by that time, Dragonite can get up and running fairly consistently. I really like this Dragonite deck. It not only did it place third at the largest tournament so far this season, but it actually has a pretty consistent win rate. overall. The 22nd most played deck, it has a 53% win rate, so it is actually performing quite well. I actually do feel like this is a real deck. It's a real contending deck right now. Do I want to put it A tier? I don't want to really jump the gun. I'm going to put it high B tier. I'm going to put it at the top of B tier, just to kind of give it the nod because of Jay Hoove and his great performance that he had this weekend. I actually like Dragonite. I think that it belongs in the format, right? Which is unique. I don't think we've really had the opportunity to say that about Dragonite, and I think that's definitely a cool thing. I'm excited to say that. Next up is Weavile Darkrai. So this is a deck that actually did fairly well in one tournament. And in my experience playing it on the rank ladder, I actually like it. It's a really fine, aggressive archetype. But again, Guzzlord is everywhere, and Guzzlord soaks up damage. This deck list is a little bit lackluster if we don't get that early combo off. And in general, I just feel like a deck list that has some early game potential, would rather just be playing sort of a turbo deck that is also quite strong in the mid to late game, like a Turbo Flareon or even like a Silvally deck like that. So I don't think this is a bad deck. I think people definitely overhyped it. I mean, I kind of overhyped it. I put it on my list of best ranks, decks for ranked last Friday. But again, the metagame was different back then. And if you were playing Repel and you were playing an aggro deck, you were going to be quite successful. Giratinas were everywhere still. And honestly, I don't feel like this is a bad deck. I really don't. Now, do I want to put it B tier or C tier? It's hard to say. It hasn't performed well in tournament. So again, I think that things are developing really quickly, that by the time this deck was viable for a little bit, people really started to kind of change the meta in a way that wasn't as kind to some of these aggressive decks. I'm going to put Weavile probably here into the C tier. I'll put it like right below Giratina and Latios. I'll put it like right here. I think that's probably fine. The C tier is full of decks that aren't bad decks. They just aren't, they don't have enough going for them to really justify playing them above all of the decks in B tier, A tier, and S tier. I think that the margins are very slim between B tier, A tier, and S tier. I think all of these decks are really, really strong. But I think that the S tier decks are really kind of driving the metagame. I think that Guzzlord has interjected itself as that number two, maybe number two spot, which I think deserves it here into the S tier. All of the A tier decks, these are like sort of the top counter meta decks. Like, it's just sort of the way that the meta goes. The S tier typically beats all of the stuff below A tier, and then the A tier decks typically beat the decks in S tier, but might struggle against the other decks, right? So that's kind of how the metagame typically works. I know some people get confused by that. The decks in the A tier, just because they beat the decks in S tier doesn't mean that they are S tier decks, right? These decks probably exist because of their good matchups into the S tier decks. So you got to keep that in mind. It's a little bit hard to understand, but if you don't understand what I'm saying, I don't really know how else to explain it, right? You have the meta, and then you have the counter meta, right? And then you have all of the other decks that sort of fit somewhere in between. So that's kind of where we have right now. This is my tier list. I feel pretty good about it going into this second week. Again, things are changing so quickly that honestly, it's really hard to say. Like, by the time next tier list rolls around, some of these decks might be completely irrelevant just because of how quickly the metagame is developing. But, that's why we stay on top of it, and that's why we upload videos daily. This has been a really, really fun season, a rapidly developing season, and I've had a really, really fun time with it. Don't forget to comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. Any decks that weren't on the tier list, I would love to hear about it. And of course, anything that you agree with or disagree with, I would love to hear your comments down in the comments section. I love the discussion for sure. Don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. Stay tuned. We'll see you guys next time. And big shout out to everybody that played in the tournament this weekend. It's been a lot of fun. I'm excited to see where the meta goes. I really am. All right, guys, let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah. Bye.